Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the Power of Resonance with Dr. Yabome Gilpin Jackson. This workshop at Reimagine is the kickoff to our four-part Grief, Growth, and Justice series. My name is Andy Engel, and I'm Senior Programmer at Reimagine, and I'm joined with my fellow Reimagine staffer, Zubin Desai, on this event. I'm in New York City, which is known by its indigenous inhabitants as Lenapehoking. And I would love for you to tell us in the chat where you are calling in from. Zubin, if you could paste in the chat www.native-land.ca. Folks can find out what indigenous territories they're on and they can paste them there. For those who may not know, Reimagine has refined its mission and vision recently. In the past, we've focused primarily on breaking taboos surrounding end of life and sparking conversations on death and dying, breaking those taboos, and celebrating the precious time that we have together. That has not changed. What is different now is that our conversations have broadened. We want to reimagine how we face the hard parts of life and transform them into meaningful action and growth. So we've been recently leaning into the theory and practice of what's known as post-traumatic growth. Maybe that sounds a little jargony to some of you. I suppose at first, post-traumatic stress disorder did as well back in the day. And we all know too well now what PTSD is. But I suspect many of you have not heard of PTG. For those who have experienced trauma, research indicates that truly shattering experiences can cause debilitating anxiety, as well as emotional and physical distress. We know this is true. And what if I told you that there's another body of psychological research, post-traumatic growth, that suggests that we can also grow, learn, and transform from trauma, loss, and other adversities. Our workshop facilitator, Dr. Yabome Gilpin Jackson, draws upon post-traumatic growth to develop her thinking on resonance, which we'll learn about shortly. So some outcomes for post-traumatic growth include an increase in personal strength, recognition of new possibilities or opportunities, improved relationships with others, appreciating life, and spiritual growth. Dr. Richard Tedeschi and other researchers in post-traumatic growth have emphasized that there are 5 ways to facilitate growth. And this season at Reimagine, we're focusing on acts of service. That's the last one here in this group. Acts of service, that might be volunteering at a food pantry in your community. That might be supporting candidates for political office, signing petitions on immigration reform, or attending a vigil on behalf of Ukrainian children. Actions, both large and small, can lead us towards personal and communal healing. And it's our belief at Reimagine that acts of service contribute to the pursuit of justice. And what motivates us to action is often rooted in love and in loss. So what is justice? We at Reimagine love this definition, courtesy of our partners at Holistic Underground. And Yabome will revisit this later in her presentation. And here it is. Justice is a state of integrity and wholeness achieved through healing and transformation. When justice is present, we can trust that our safety and well-being are valued in a community or society. So now I'm ending my slide share. Now I can see all of you very clearly. And now it's my great honor to introduce Dr. Yabome Gilpin Jackson. She is an award-winning applied social scientist who works with communities to build capacity for social change and transformation. She is a global citizen, born in Germany, raised in Sierra Leone, and educated in Canada and the US. She is an author and certified executive coach. Her most recent publication is Transformation After Trauma, The Power of Resonance. This year, she begins a new role at Simon Fraser University's, and she is their first Vice President for People, Equity, and Inclusion. She lives in British Columbia, Canada. Please offer a warm welcome to Dr. Yabome Gilpin Jackson.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andy, for that warm introduction. And thank you to all of you for joining this late afternoon and evening around the world. I know it's getting quite late on the East Coast, so really appreciate seeing so many names and faces and folks from all over joining to be part of this conversation and this workshop today. It was absolutely a pleasure and an easy piece to say yes to. As Andy knows from our conversation, post-traumatic growth, PTG, has been very much a part of my research, as is transformation and transformative learning. So I'm looking forward to being in this conversation and this process with you, which really builds on those traditions and a bit more, as you will see momentarily, and to see where that takes us. So I'm going to first share my screen just to make sure. I want to also acknowledge, as some of you have been doing, and as Andy did, that I am joining you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Katsi and Kwantlen and Coast Salish peoples, among others, east of what we call Vancouver. And I thought that I will sort of link to the definition of justice that Andy started with right from the get-go. And we'll keep playing with this throughout as we journey through the power of resonance. But I thought I'd start by linking here because I am joining you not only in the context, in a world where the United Nations has had to declare the rights of Indigenous peoples and call nations to stand for and support those rights. But I'm also joining you as an Indigenous West African woman from a previously colonized nation by heritage that continues to shake with the rumblings of those impacts, as well as, because of where I'm situated here in Canada, joining you from a nation in reckoning when it comes to this idea of justice. As we think about and work through what truth and reconciliation means in a context where we continue to recover unmarked graves of Indigenous children who were taken into residential schools, and continue to deal with the repercussions, the generational impacts of missing and murdered women and children, including through the residential school time and post that through the 60s scoop, and even to today, where children who were no longer taken to residential schools were taken into the foster care system. And even today, in very recent history, Indigenous women continue to be subjected to violence and are missing and murdered. I know that these are hard issues, but this is where to start as we talk about justice. I love this definition. And in sort of colloquial terms, for me, I think about justice also as restoring right relationship. What I love about this definition as well is that it centers integrity and wholeness, which for me captures that idea of right relationship. We cannot make whole unless we heal. And part of healing is that truth part. Reconciliation is part of the transformation part, but I would suggest to you as we go through that it is beyond that. Many of you that work in justice movements know that many injustice movements are standing for redress and reparations, and should and will continue to do that. We also know that even where redress and reparations are possible, in some cases, I wonder if they are. But even where they are possible, we know that it will never restore what has been lost for people that are impacted in traumatic ways, both currently and generationally. And so what is actually needed is transformation. It's the ability to heal and transform these circumstances so that the second part of this definition can be true, which is that for communities that have been adversely impacted through generations, that we can return to a wholeness where we have collective trust in the safety and well-being of all in society. And so I really like this expanded definition for that reason. So wanted you to keep in mind the part about healing and transformation as we go through. Very much stand with Adrienne Mary Brown on the idea of transformative justice over and beyond restorative justice. And this definition really captures that for me. And so you'll see how we play with that as we go through. And so here's our overview. As we carry forward, we'll discuss the power of resonance to transform trauma. And we'll talk about that momentarily. We'll experience resonance stories individually and collectively in this space and what that means for creating alternative narratives that we can step into, including in the ways of acts of service, as Andy pointed out, and I'll come back to that idea. And then we will share your insights and applications. We'll see where this takes us. This is very much a journey. I'm going to warn you now, it's a wine tasting through a piece of work that can go very deep and very broad. This is a session that I can do over multiple days with intact groups that are working on particular issues. So hold this today as an opportunity to be introduced to these ideas and to build on the work you already do. I invite you to stay engaged, to allow yourself to experience discomfort. This is an emotional conversation. But allow you to just lean into whatever comes up for you. Speak your truth, respectfully so, using I to own your own experiences, and please hold back from projecting your experience in the moment on others. And expect and accept non-closure. This conversation will not be complete. Part of my hope today is to seed some things with you that you will take forward into your work, into your life, wherever you find yourself, into the work you do in the world, or just personally for yourself, however this may best serve you. And so I'm not going to say more about this, but this is just the paradigms that this work lands in, including post-traumatic growth, very much a trauma-informed lens to looking back and looking forward at when we've been in traumatic circumstances, and taking into account transformation, as I said earlier, and definitely narratives and story, which we are about to enter into. And so I'm going to ask you to come along and do this piece with me. I will ask you to work in Slido a few times today, just because it's easier to see the information at a glance instead of using the Zoom chat. I love Zoom chat, but we are a slightly bigger group and expecting a few more as we go through. So I'm going to invite you to use Slido today. Please, if you would, click or either use the QR code, or if you have your phone with you, go on your browser or even on another tab on your computer screen. You can enter slido.com and you'll have a hashtag prompt there. Please enter reimagine GGJ, which stands for not my last name. Grief, growth, and justice is what that stands for. Struck me that it sounded like GJ Andy, which I use for my last name. So if you would put in reimagine GGJ, what will pop up is a screen that asks you a question that seems abstract. But again, I'll just ask you to engage with the question as is. The question is, what do they say about justice movements in this era? And this is partly how we're going to check in today. I'm going to have you go into your first breakout group momentarily. But first, just so I see what's coming in from the collective, once you're in Slido, please respond to the question. It can be very brief, it could be just a phrase. Answer the question as it strikes you. What do they say, interpret they as you will, about justice movements in this era? And let's see, I am just gonna multitask a little bit here and see what's starting to come in. All right, don't see them coming in yet. There you go, see them coming in, thank you. All right, I will be able to briefly show you these before you go to checkout. I'll just read some as they're coming in. So much work to be done, necessary activism, cancel culture, too sensitive, or real change. They are afraid that people will ask too much. It is difficult or not possible. They are an annoyance, social media movements. Yeah, there is no justice. Politically correct, keep them coming. That it is action of agitators. Yeah. Thank you so much. I see about 22 of you have responded here. Powerful, dangerous, unpatriotic. Yeah. More platforms to reach and awaken people, but run the risk of fatigue. Yeah. Keep them coming. So in a moment, I'm gonna try to share the Slido screen, and I'll just scroll through them so that you can read them. I'm just gonna ask you to capture what strikes you, and then we're going to get set for a breakout group. So just give me a moment. I will share the screen with you. Keep them coming, those of you who have not had a chance yet. All right, start from the bottom. So I'm scrolling through, just invite you to read. Again, you may not be able to read it all. All right. I like this one. Who determines what is justice? Feels very complicated, and who is driving the movement? Absolutely. Love this one too. Justice movements are great as long as they don't make me uncomfortable. I can tell you I've done this session a lot, and that is one I see often in response to this. Exhaustion. Just scroll through. What is justice? Isn't that what we have now? What's so important? I don't understand. Okay. So questions, comments. All right. So just think about what's sitting with you as you look at this list. I'm going to take it down. All right. So we are all back now. And you had a very fast 10 minutes, yes, to talk about why you're here and what stood out to you to what they say. The responses you put on Slido, as I insinuated, there's always something new and different, and there's always a nuance in different groups. But it's fairly, some of the pieces are fairly thematic to what I have seen and what I hear and what all of us are hearing as we individually go through the world at this time, or work in this space, or try to figure out how to navigate the current reality, especially around growth, grief, and justice. So just returning to that list that you offered in the Slido, a lot of it points to the very real impacts that we're all experiencing right now. And for many, what we are experiencing is a dominant narrative that can be traumatic and that can have traumatic impact. Because when you look at the lists that get generated, you don't even need a list. You can just look at what we're hearing in the news, what we're seeing on social media. It's a lot. It's screens like this and so much more that really can often send us to a place of being stuck, or a place of wondering where to find hope, right? So part of the practice that I'm about to invite you to, which is this idea around resonance. And remember, I'm not going to go into a lot of technicality, but resonance and post-traumatic growth are grounded in a lot of research, and certainly has been borne out from my work over 10 years of research and practice in this space, including sessions like what we're in today. Part of being able to move from being stuck to a transformative space is being able to name and unpack the reality that we are in. And so when we look at the kinds of lists that we just generated, or the one that I just showed, part of the practice is to think about what is this narrative that we're in, and actually to be able to name it in the first place, right? So there's a truism in the social sciences popularized by someone by the name of Daniel Siegel, that you have to name it. And in social psychology, you have to name it to tame it, right? And many of you that work in these spaces, in counseling, in any kind of therapy, I'm sure understand that. Name it to tame it. So here are some questions. We're not going to walk through them. This is just to, if you were doing this with others that you support, to think about the questions you need to be thinking about and supporting other people to think through from a post-traumatic growth lens. And at the back end, you'll see how this connects. What individual and collective narratives are we in? Where do these stories come from? What are the fundamental beliefs associated with these narratives? Where did the narrative come from? What is the impact? This is an important one. What's the impact on me? What's the impact on the whole? Whatever that whole is, a group, an organization, society. And if that impact is difficult and traumatic, that's where the work we're about to do comes in. Often when I'm working with groups, I am working with them because they're already aware that they're in difficult traumatic circumstances and they're wanting to do this work. So we start here. We start with them naming the dominant culture. We start with them naming the dominant narratives that they're in. And we often give the narrative a name. Right? So I worked with this group once, and I'll always remember this because it wasn't a typical kind of name that I've heard. They called their dominant narrative the screen, right? They're like, this is the narrative we're all stuck in. This is the vortex we're in. It's a bit of a screen. And so what that does is allows us to name where people are at so that we can keep referring to it, we can unpack it, and it can help us, as we'll see on the other end, disempower the scream a little bit because we have a name for it. And we can decide, because all of us have choice, what our relationship needs to be to the screen. Okay, so just to pull that forward then, particularly when we're in traumatic circumstances, specifically naming trauma as events of seismic proportions that have significantly challenged our worldview. It's challenged our assumptions. That's where this work comes in. And I often say to people, before COVID, it was kind of hard sometimes to describe traumatic impact on a broad scale. And now it's not so difficult because all of us can think about what we've been through, unfortunately, with the COVID-19 pandemic. That is traumatic on a global scale, because it changed our assumptions about how we live, how we interact with others, how we socialize, how we work. It impacted every aspect of our lives and changed our assumptions. Whether we liked those changes or not is a different question, but it did challenge our assumptions. And therefore, it had immense emotional and psychological impact on individuals, on organizations. Working remotely was born in a formal, here to stay maybe kind of way. And I say for many of us, I might have been working remotely before COVID, but suddenly with COVID, it was forced choice. And that's different because our human minds love freedom and agency and choice, right? And so that presented a challenge and it presented emotional impact. So that's the context within which we might think about, how do we transform this? How do we work with ourselves and others to be able to move from where we're stuck in potential traumatic circumstances, as Andy said, so that we're not just operating from the stress response, but also from a growth orientation, which is what today is about. So I'm going to stop my screen again, and I'm just going to quickly read to you why it's so important to locate our stories and the narratives that we're operating under and from. So I'm going to read a brief excerpt from the Encyclopedia of Leadership when they used to still make them. I think the last print one was published, I believe, in 2004. But I love this excerpt from it because it really says why we need to understand where we are so that we can contend with where we need to go. So here goes. I can only answer the question, what am I to do? If I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part? We enter human society, that is with one or more imputed characters, roles into which we are drafted. And we have to learn what they are in order to be able to understand how others respond to us and how our responses to them will be construed. The questions, what am I to do? And of what story am I a part? Capture the essence of leadership. Leaders ask and answer, what are we to do? Effective leadership asks further, implicitly or explicitly, of what story are we a part? And that's what this is about and where post-traumatic growth and resonance come in. It's the practice of figure out when we are stuck in these traumatic circumstances, going back so that we can go forward and asking what story are we a part of? And then personally asking yourself, what am I to do? And what are we to do? So that's the context we're working with. And that's where we can start to think about and choose, how do we move forward from this dominant narrative, right? This dominant narrative that we named in What Do They Say? Because that is the narrative around us. How do we move from that to something that allows us to have choice and have agency and figure out what is our part, right? What am I to do? What are we to do? So what? How do we move forward? I love this African parable as well. No matter how hard it may get, a way out or eventual comfort will be provided, specifically from one of the North African countries that the attribution hasn't been sourced. But it's this idea that no matter the hardships we're in, comes relief. And that's where resonance takes us. This is a bit of an eye chart. You're not meant to read it all right now, but this is the key points on it. When we've been hit with traumatic circumstances, there are actually three options. The post-traumatic stress response, which Andy talked about in the opening, which is natural. As human beings, when we are impacted with trauma, that immediate psychological and emotional impact will automatically reduce our normal level of functioning. That is the classical definition of post-traumatic stress. We have stress responses, and those can be exacerbated over time, and that is where we need individual support or counseling or therapy or whatever we might need to work through. I want to emphasize a post-traumatic stress response is a normal response to traumatic injury. The other possibility in our humanity is to bounce back. This is one we talk about a lot. It's the resilient response. What is often lost and what I want to emphasize today is resiliency is a bouncing back to our normal level of functioning. It doesn't necessarily include growth. And as we talk about growth and transformation, that is where post-traumatic growth comes in. That is the third option. We can roll back, we can bounce back, or we can do what I call bouncing forward. Being kind to ourselves when our normal emotional states are reduced and we have to work on ourselves to get back to resiliency is great. And then if we have a desire for growth, what does that look like? And what does that mean? It starts with the orientation of knowing and understanding that post-traumatic growth and transformation is a possible response to trauma. And in the research and from clinical practitioners, what we know is post-traumatic stress is often clinically diagnosed and supported. So it's been easy to keep track of it, and there's more research on it. But increasingly, what we found in the literature is upwards of 70+% of people also eventually, if they've been able to bounce back from post-traumatic stress to a resilient place, they're able to bounce forward to growth. Now, post-traumatic growth doesn't negate stress reactions. I consider myself a person that has come through stress, has found a resilient place, and has moved forward to growth. And there are times where those triggered stress reactions still show up. And actually, that's what I love in terms of the realism of post-traumatic growth, is it can coexist with stress responses. We're not saying that if you have any stress responses, it means that you're not oriented to growth or haven't experienced growth. But it does say that growth and transformation are possible. So how do you access that possibility? And that's where resonance comes in. I had the privilege over 10 years ago now to do some research with transformational leaders who were identified in their communities, people who had had significant trauma on a broad scale, war traumas. Just think about what we're all hearing and seeing and experiencing with Ukraine and Russia in the moment. And people who had come out of those kinds of circumstances and yet were identified as significant leaders who were transformational in their communities. They were nominated from their communities for this research. They didn't identify themselves as transformational leaders, other people did because of their work in the world. And what was interesting about these group of people is on the surface, if you just met them, you wouldn't necessarily identify them with any of the traumas or stereotypes and et cetera that they had been through. And in working with this group, I identified this idea, which is simple but powerful, is the idea of resonance, which is at the heart of the learning that is possible that leads to transformation, the learning zone that evokes transformation. Many people in the human development space and education psychology have talked about this zone. It's the region between an event that happens to us and our reaction or our response. And initially, when we're reacting from stress. But eventually, if we choose a response, we begin to be oriented to growth and transformation becomes possible. What I found was what was at the heart of evoking this possibility of transformation was resonance that happened through storytelling. And that's what I'm about to invite you to. As we segue into that, I just want to point out this quote from Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning, a very popular one that is often quoted. And I like to remind people that while it's often quoted, the context within which Viktor Frankl wrote this is often left behind. Viktor Frankl was a concentration camp survivor. And in his work, he wrote, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Resonance opens up that space. And that's the invitation that I'm about to offer you. Resonance happens through storytelling, actually through very personal stories. A resonance story in particular is a personal story. So very much oriented in someone's own life, someone's own past that deeply connects you to identity and purpose. Resonance stories can entail any of the storytelling forms. So verbal, written, symbolic, metaphoric, expressive forms. I'm going to invite you into the verbal form, but as I invite you to reflect on your story before I send you into breakout groups, if you're a person that thinks in pictures, then draw whatever symbol comes up for you, because that is powerful as well. And so I just wanted to mention that as we move into this space. These are the characteristics of resonance and resonance stories. Again, it comes from your own life. It could be as far back as childhood to a recent past event. It deeply connects you and signifies to you your organizational or personal life purpose, and especially depending on the context of your resonance story, because you can have a few different ones, but in the context of your resonance story, it can anchor you to your purpose in, say, a justice movement, which is what I will invite you to think about, the context I'll invite you to think about for your resonance story today. Resonance stories trigger emotionality and that sense of nostalgia. And this was very much from the research and the characteristics of the stories that people told. They're emotional, they have a bit of nostalgia to them. Because of that, resonance stories run the gamut of our human emotions. So they can be everything from a story that is sad for you to a story that is joyful and happy, and all of that is okay. And this is my way of saying emotions are welcome in this space, because your story should evoke that. Your resonance story should evoke that. And fundamentally, resonance stories provoke insight. They shift you basically from automatic reactive thinking to giving you a space to be insightful and reflectful about your response to the circumstances that you find yourself within. And otherwise, a resonance story orients you to transformation. Again, it opens that space for transformation. This is how one of the participants in my original research described resonance. This was a participant through their written account in a book. And they said this: something in me had changed. This was after the moment where they locked onto their resonance story. I knew now that I could look back, that I could look forward and back without any regrets at the same time. This is almost the definition of post-traumatic growth. The ability to be realistic about the circumstances, traumatic as they may be, and yet to be able to look forward, to be able to look to possibility, to be able to look to what needs to be done to transform this situation. And so in a moment, I'm going to invite you to journal. So if you have a writing implement, a piece of paper, or maybe you're like me and you type on your screen these days, please be prepared to jot down notes for yourself. The notes are for yourself of what surfaces for you when you think about what I've been saying of resonance stories. I'm going to invite you to capture a resonance story from your life, specifically a resonance story that connects you to the justice movements that you care about. But before we do that, one more thing I'm going to do to characterize resonance is to play for you momentarily this song from, that's the song Memory from Cats. But in particular, it's the Heather Headley version, because while many of us might know the Barbra Streisand version, the original version, Heather Headley performs this song in the emotive way that also illustrates the power of resonance and what I am asking you to do in terms of going back to your own memories, your memory of self and of identity and purpose. So give me a moment. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can split screens and put on this song. Immediately after this, I'm going to ask you to reflect for a minute or two and then invite you into breakout groups. So you will share a resonance story in breakout group. Be prepared for that. But first, just to get us prepared for doing so, here is Heather Headley from Memory. And Zubin or Andy, if you can let me know if you can see my screen and hear the sound, you can do it in chat, that would be great.
Midnight, not a sound from the pavement. Has the moon lost her memory? She is smiling alone in the lamplight. The withered leaves collect at my feet, and the wind begins to moan. Memory, all I Every street lamp seems to beat a fatalistic warning. Someone mutters and the street lamp gutters, and soon it will be morning. In the daylight, I must wait for the sunrise. I must think of a new life, and I mustn't give in. When the dawn comes tonight, will be a memory too, and a new day will begin.
Unlike the trees in summer, endless masquerading,
Like a flower as the dawn is breaking, the memories are fading. Talk to me, it's so easy to leave me all alone with the memory of my days in the sun. If you taught me, you'll understand what happiness is. Look, a new day has
Look, a new day has begun. The invitation to you now is to just write some notes on what story from your life, to a person, an event, a thing, a trigger with the quality of nostalgia, deeply connects you to the justice movements you care about. The invitation here is to just write your stream of consciousness in this moment, your unedited thoughts, feelings, and imagery. This is your internal monologue. You'll be invited to share with another person because that is the power of this practice. But for now, just journal for a minute or so, and then we are going to send you into breakout groups. I'll put up the prompt, and it's also going to go in chat for you in a moment. A story from your life that deeply connects you to the justice movements you care about. In a moment, we're going to go to breakout groups. And here's the invitation. The invitation is to share your resonance story, but want to remind you that you're being invited into transformational listening space. That this is sacred and brave space. These are our personal stories to something that matters deeply to each person in your triad. And part of the power of this practice is in this space you're sharing maybe with people you don't know. And we know that in mirroring each other, it's very different to talk to another human than it is to even talk to ourselves in the mirror. something happens for us, and that something is it allows for insight and meaning making. And so just invite you as a speaker to share what you want to. Be brave, extend trust and vulnerability, allow insights to emerge, don't censor yourself, and be willing to be witnessed. And as you listen, please suspend judgment. Listen to learn in the diversity of this space. No fixing, no caretaking. It's very easy to say, oh, me too, or to try to take over someone's story. But remember, this is about the speaker, not about you. And you'll have your turn in the circle. Be open to surprises. Listen for the gifts of the conversation to you, and be ready to witness. That's all this space is about. This is going to go really quickly. The invitation is really to take 2 to 3 minutes each to share. You don't have to share the full context of your story, just the heart of it. And that's partly why in this open session, it's 15 minutes in this breakout. Actually, 10 minutes, sorry, in this breakout. So each of you have about 3 minutes. Share the heart of your story. Others say thank you, and then rotate through. And then you might have an extra minute or so. If you do, just share what impacted you. And when we come back into the space, we'll pick up there. We won't be sharing your personal stories in the space, just what the impacts have been of sharing in the circle that you're in. And so on that invitation to your story circle, as this is called, to share a story from your life that deeply connects you to the justice movements you care about, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to ask Zubin to send us to breakout. If you were able to go on Slido earlier, please go back in there and you'll see there's a new prompt, which is what the impact of sharing your resonance story. So what was the impact? Just asking about impact right now. You don't have to share your stories in this big space. But I'd love to see some people enter that on Slido. If you were not able to get on Slido, feel free to put it in chat. This is just so that we get a collective glimpse at what the experience was. And as I did earlier, I will at least verbally share some of those so that we get a sense of what happened in the space. All right. Thank you. I see them starting to come in. A commonality between us. Isn't that wonderful? Such an impact of this work. I've been in rooms where the air is thick with division when I walk in. And by the time we do resonance stories, the energy is completely different. Empowering to hear another person's story. The importance of things like dance and art, absolutely. It's why even though when I'm pressed for time, I still play the Heather Headley song, bringing in a different part of our brains and embodied experiences as we work through. Connection and understanding, keep them coming. And whatever your experience was is absolutely welcome in this space. Let's see. Deep pain, great strength. I love that. Isn't that a capture of what post-traumatic growth does for us? It's the ability to return to a memory that, yes, may be painful, but from an orientation to look forward, right? Or an orientation to look both back and forward. Love that. Can't tell another story by looking at them. Isn't that the truth? Deeply moving, compassionate alignment. Deeply rooted, not only in my story, but in others' stories. These are really powerful. Keep them coming. And I see one in chat. I'll just read that one. I learned that different types of trauma have the same effect. Actually, they do. Physiologically, they do. We are all connected in the human experience. I love that comment. And I would say, this is why, especially when I'm doing work grounded in justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, it's often easy for people to go to that divisive space. Just as like at the beginning in your what do they say, that showed up really quickly. What I like to remind people is that in the human experience, we've all experienced adversity. We've all experienced some kind of suffering. The work of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion is recognizing that human condition and also recognizing that for some parts of our society, just because of how we've structured the world, and this is us, humanity, that structured the world in the way it's currently structured, some people are exposed to deeper levels of trauma generationally and through the present. And so if each of us can connect to the pain of adversity that we've experienced, maybe my hope is always that that will shift people who may be on the fence or maybe on the other side of saying, why does this matter? To really think about, well, why would it matter to me to have pain that I have experienced be redressed when others can do that? And maybe that shifts people to seeing why justice matters for everyone. So hopefully that makes sense. Empathic resonance. I just love these that have come through today. Thank you. Keep them coming, but for the sake of time, just gonna quickly share the screen and scan through them. Only got about 14 of you on there. So if there's anything else you wanna add, feel free to. I'll leave the poll open while I summarize, but I'll just quickly scan through. Zubin, just let me know if this is showing on screen as I scroll through.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, awesome. Right. Just look at them, and for the sake of time, I will move us forward just to move to some summative pieces here. Okay. But keep them coming. I'll keep that poll open for them for a couple minutes. So here's what I want you to take away. By no means has this session been exhaustive, but it's been just meant, again, to give you a sense of this practice. And here are a few things. I showed this visual earlier, and here's where resonance fits. Resonance, in adding it in, allows people to move towards that growth orientation, just as your impact comments just illustrated, because it opens up connection. It rehumanizes the experiences that we've had in a way that allows us to connect back to what is most important to us. In a piece that I wrote about resonance transformation, I talked about the practice of resonance really being about reconnection, about remembering, right? Remember, the root of the word remember is to put back together. And I love that this is a space for reimagining. A lot of what we do in resonance is that collecting ourselves back together, back to the center of our humanity, and then thinking forward based on that. So here's what resonance does. This is what the research has shown of this practice. It provokes insight. It allows us to make meaning in new ways. And it has to happen, and this, for those of you that work in areas where you're supporting others, very important to note that resonance has to happen in a space of trusted disclosure. People need to feel not only safe, but brave enough to have the courage enough to disclose. And that happens because they know that they're in a space of non-judgment, they know that they're supported, and that they can freely share their story, even when it might be different from others in that space. With those conditions in place, resonance provokes a realization of purpose. What is my purpose in this justice movement based on my resonance story? It deeply connects us to humanity in a new way. Again, your comments illustrated that. It provokes deeper spiritual and moral development. Consistently, people who experience resonance in the study that I did and the follow-up pieces of work I've done and written about are provoked to a deeper sense of development for themselves. Because suddenly, like not suddenly, sometimes resonance is a long time coming, but experiences they've gone through matter in a new way through the lens of their resonance story. It brings a new valuing of life. As we were sending you out to breakouts, Zubin, on sort of unprompted, I would say, shared what to me was a resonance story and talked about how that has inspired looking at life in new ways and in taking actions differently because of the experience that inspired him. And then it provokes this determination and the will to act. And this is the crux, is when we support people to operate from resonance and not from fear, not out of the trauma, is there's a certain determination that comes with that, that even when roadblocks continue to show up, they're able to return to resonance. And from that place, figure out, okay, what am I going to do next? And this is the place where people name a new narrative for themselves. So if I were working with a group, I would at this point say, okay, what is the resonance narrative that you want to create? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What actions are you taking? So for those of you that might do strategic planning work, this is where we do that work, that thinking and planning together. And then when people are feeling stuck, we come back to what matters most. What's the resonance story that brought us together? And part of how we do that is by naming the new narrative. So imagine that group that I said earlier had named their dominant narrative the scream, naming a narrative of connection for themselves. And when they found themselves stuck, going back to, okay, is this action or this place where we're stuck? Is it moving us forward to our resonant narrative, or is it taking us back to the scream? And that is why naming your narratives matter. So I'll skip this for a moment. I wanted to go here. Take, for example, this group. I had their permission to use these flip charts after their work together. These are groups that had named their initial narratives, as you can see here, frenetic devaluation. And their resonant narrative was collective nourishing. Narrative of profound loss and sorrow. And their resonant narrative was a culture of resonance, resilience, and transformation. So taking all three of those parts and pulling it into their space, okay? So if you are a practitioner that works with others, what can you do with this? Understand trauma narratives, give people space to voice what's so for them, that's the dominant narrative. Then help them connect to resonance. And then and only then move to possibilities and action. Oftentimes what I find is people go straight here. What's possible? Let's just move forward. Again, there's no truth. There's no reconciliation without truth. There's no transformation without healing. And I would say there's no post-traumatic growth without understanding our trauma narratives first. So, and then sometimes people spend all the time on the trauma narrative. And what happens is people end up stuck here. There's no space forward because there's no inspiration. There's no forward movement. There's a quote I often use, I don't have it on me today, from a theorist in the space of transformation that talks about the narratives can hit a point where they're debilitating, but we have to remember that the transformative power of our narrative starts with naming those traumatic narratives, but we have to watch that line so that we don't shift into a debilitating space, but we shift forward into resonance and transformation. So it's a subtle and powerful shift for those of you working in the space of supporting others. Many practices around this, we won't go into them today. Here's a cheat sheet of things, and I will ask the team, Zubin, if you don't mind just popping this list in chat so that as we move forward towards the close here, it's on slide 28 on the deck that you have. If you just copy these into the chat, things to be mindful of, again, if you're working with others in how you support and facilitate them to connect to resonance and then to move forward in planning for transformation. And so through the lens of your resonance story, I'm going to ask you to just jot a few notes as I ask you these questions. This is one way that you can facilitate resonance, is get people to the space of their resonance story. So answering the question like the one I asked you, what is a story with a quality of nostalgia that deeply connects you to XYZ. In this case, we use justice movements. Once they have that, support them or yourself in this case to think about, okay, based on this resonance story, what needs to be transformed? What is my interior state about what needs to be transformed? Again, remembering that there's power in naming even when there's fear there. I often ask people, what are your hopes and what are your fears? And get them to name that and talk through that. And then to say what action is needed now. So I want you to really muse on what action is needed now for you. Might give space for a minute or two for people to just voice those in a moment. But this is what I encourage you to do. And I would say is your takeaway from this space is to know that whenever you feel stuck, how can you return to your resonant story and ask yourself these questions? And you could also ask yourself any of the questions around this wheel. What is my purpose? How does this connect me to others? What deeper development does this call me to? How did this story help me better appreciate? How will it help me better appreciate life and others around me? And what action is this calling me to? So here's my resonance story, which is a story that deeply connects me to the justice movement of Black Lives Matters. And it may seem obvious that as a Black woman, this is something that I always cared about and worked on, but actually it wasn't always, not in the way that I do now. It's something I always knew about, something I was always conscious about, something I always learned cognitively. I mentioned that I, by heritage, I'm both Sierra Leonean and Canadian, and I grew up in Sierra Leone. And so I grew up on a very colonial education system. So while I knew cognitively about the history of Black peoples globally, and actually, especially Black people from Sierra Leone, where there is still a slave port and heritage site where people were taken from, I probably knew more about European history than I knew about what that meant for my life. My resonance story started in drips, mostly when I returned on my journey back to the West, on my return to Canada. I have Canadian-born siblings. My parents studied here in the 50s and 60s, is why our family ended up also in Canada. And I returned here to go back to do my post-secondary education, also leaving Sierra Leone in the context of war. So I left, not unlike what we're seeing on the news right now as Ukrainian citizens leave Ukraine. And so that has been really triggering for me. And I can tell you that I started facing anti-Black racism from the first airport I landed in outside of the African continent. In fact, I started experiencing the colonial divides within the African continent when I moved from British Africa to French Africa. On my way out, I suddenly couldn't go to school. I didn't speak French well enough to work while I waited for my Canadian paperwork to come through. And there I was living with the colonial heritage and the impacts of that. I arrived in the US and I was held up because of my Sierra Leonean passport, even though my Canadian papers were intact. I missed my flight because there was a feeling that I might run away into the US and become an undocumented immigrant. I arrived in Canada and was often hit with the question, how come your English is so good? And of course, the where are you from question. And all of this I could live with. I'm an adult, I can deal with this, or at least I was a young adult. And as you can probably see from who I am, I can stand up for myself. So I didn't worry about this too much. I did what I needed to do. I was in the social sciences space, so I started to learn more. But my resonance story really landed for me when my children started coming home, asking me the same questions that I was hit with all the time. So it's really grounded in the experience of my daughter coming home and asking me, Mom, what do I respond when people ask me where am I from? Or when she started saying, and she's Canadian born, or when she started saying, Mom, I notice that my classmates don't always want to play with me. And in fact, she had had an experience where a kid had made a comment about his skin, and that being the reason why he did not want to touch her, to the extent that he didn't want to share a piece of paper that they were supposed to be working on together with her. That was my moment. That was my resonance story. Because I realized that I might be okay dealing with these things, but I wasn't okay for my children. And yes, I was standing on the shoulders of my parents who had defied all of the colonial history, made it to Canada on scholarships, served their country and the world in the roles they held around the world. I could stand on their shoulders, but I couldn't be complacent because I needed to speak, to write, and to talk about these issues. And that's why I do the work that I do. And I go back there whenever I'm hit, because I'm continually hit with these issues, whether from microaggressions, whether being the keynote speaker that's mistaken for food services when I show up, or whatever the case may be, is I remember for my children. I have a story from last week. I have a story from last month. I have a story from right now where my children were told things they should not be told in 2022 at their school, this very Black History Month, by classmates that you wonder how we're repeating the generational injustices. And so I go back there and I call you to action and ask you to anchor to the resonant story that matters for you in the justice issues that you care about, and do the work. It's not going to be any easier than it was a generation ago, because there are different issues today. Hopefully, there's an easier path in some ways, but it is going to be the continued work of many. And I believe in the power of transformation, that it is ultimately the work of many and the continued work of all of us that leads to those butterfly effects, where all of a sudden it feels like nothing's moving, and then there's another move, and then there's another move forward. That is transformation. It doesn't happen with a light switch. It happens over time because many people keep taking action. So that's my call to action, and that is our session today. I realize that I've gone 2 minutes over. So Andy, I'm going to hand it over to you. I was going to open the floor, but unfortunately, as always, this is a really fast 90 minutes to do this work. So I'll just turn it back over to you.
Yeah, well, I would love if we could keep going with you. This was so inspiring. I feel inspired both on a personal level to do more of this work on developing my resonance story, and also inspired to take action in the world. We're in a moment now that feels like there is so much despair, but you've given me a boost, and I hope others feel the same in this group. I want to encourage all of you to attend our next workshop on April 13th. And that is with another fantastic workshop leader, Stacey Haynes, who will be focusing on somatics. So you can register at www.letsreimagine.org. We will be doing a follow-up email to all of you who registered, and for those who weren't able to show up, but we'll be sending out some materials to all of you, including a recording of this. Again, I just want to offer my thanks to you, Yabome. Can we all give a little round of applause to Yabome?
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for staying. Feel free to put a word in Slido. It's still up for a word cloud if you can. I realize we're over. I'll stay in the space. I usually do open up and have more of a conversation, but I'll stay in the space. If anyone has a question or two, I'm happy to stay on for another couple of minutes as we close. If you have to go, please feel free. I know it's late on the East Coast. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yabome.